How does the partial pressure affect release of oxygen from hemoglobin? Remember that hemoglobin is a tetramer, 4 proteins that are bound together, and each one can bind an oxygen. A problem is that these are binding proteins, and while we want oxygen to bind in the lungs or the gills, we also need oxygen to be released in the tissues. And as a binding protein, hemoglobin has a tendency to hold on to its oxygen. That's great for transport, but we need it released when needed. We look at release using what are called oxygen dissociation curves. In an oxygen dissociation curve, we go from 100% bound to 0%, and the axis is percent oxygen saturation of hemoglobin from 0 to 100%. The x-axis is partial pressure of oxygen in millimeters of mercury. Remember that 160 is the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level in air. A typical oxygen dissociation curve for a mammal looks like this. At 160, it's 100% saturated. At partial pressure of 80, it's still close to 100% saturated. At a partial pressure of 60, it's releasing maybe a quarter of its oxygen. At a partial pressure of 40, we may be about half of the oxygen has been released. At a partial pressure of 20, most of it's released, and at 0, all is released. So let's think about what that means in an animal. In a mammal, this is the range of partial pressures in the lungs. And in severely oxygen-depleted tissue, we may be down at partial pressures of 20 and below. That would be typical of very hard-working muscle. We have areas where there's just partial depletion and areas where there's more moderate depletion. So in the lungs, where we're absorbing oxygen, but almost none is released. In severely oxygen-depleted tissues, almost all of it's released. So the place where you most need the oxygen, it's being released very easily until there's none left. In these intermediate areas, you get oxygen released in proportion to the extent to which the tissue is depleted. So in a typical mammal, this is the situation in the lungs. This is the situation in depleted, oxygen-depleted tissue. And this is the situation in intermediate stages. In each breath, you start with air in the lungs in which the hemoglobin is picking up that oxygen and is nearly 100% saturated. And then it moves from the lungs to different areas of tissue. And depending upon where it goes, it may release very little. If it's going through muscle, for example, that is completely relaxed and doing nothing. If it's going through areas that are using some oxygen but not a lot, it will release some but may retain still as much as 50%. Only in severely depleted tissue is it releasing all of its oxygen. Blood is going back to the lungs and picking up more oxygen. Under most circumstances, it doesn't really matter that we haven't used up a lot of the oxygen in the blood that's going to tissues that are high in oxygen, because the lungs are replacing it easily. But under conditions where you have some of your tissues are using oxygen very rapidly, you may not be able to get enough oxygen in the lungs, in which case the oxygen that's still present in blood coming back to the heart is actually quite important to make it easier to maintain high oxygen content. So in every breath, you're going from this region in the lungs with nearly 100% saturation down to areas of varyingly oxygen-depleted tissues and back. So to answer our question, hemoglobin is picking up oxygen in the lungs, delivering it and releasing it in high amounts where most needed and in low amounts where not needed. You have other important oxygen-binding proteins. Again, here is our curve for hemoglobin. But you have another curve for another oxygen-binding protein, myoglobin. This is the oxygen-binding protein that's common in muscle, and its curve looks like this. So myoglobin is abundant in oxidative muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers, and some smooth muscle. What's myoglobin doing? Myoglobin has a very high affinity. If myoglobin is partially depleted, it'll actually pick up oxygen. Oxygen will be transferred from the blood to the myoglobin to maintain this oxygen store in myoglobin. What myoglobin is being used for in a muscle fiber is both to create a high concentration gradient to move oxygen into that muscle and as a brief oxygen store. One concentration gradient for partial pressure of oxygen, because even when this muscle fiber has a lot of oxygen bound to myoglobin, it'll pull out most of the oxygen and store it even when the partial pressure of oxygen is only 20. It maintains a low partial pressure, a high gradient, favoring oxygen movement into the muscle fiber. And two, it's a short-term storage of oxygen. In the brain, you have a related protein, neuroglobin, that has affinity curves similar to that of myoglobin, and again, that iron binds in oxygen, and the affinity is very steep. The result is that it'll pull oxygen out of blood into cells in the brain that have neuroglobin, providing a high partial pressure gradient and a brief oxygen store for the brain.